Hello, welcome back to Dinosaurs. So today we're going to talk about Archosaurs and the very earliest dinosaurs. Then we're going to get into stuff that lived in the Mesozoic that wasn't dinosaurs, so some of your favorites. A lot of people said pterosaurs were their favorite dinosaurs. Not dinosaurs, but we will talk about them. So we'll talk about them on Wednesday. We'll get into dinosaur classification, and then we'll just get into some of the overall kind of dinosaur behavioral stuff and how we know that and how paleontologists systematically look at these things. Before we do that though, let's do some announcements. So please drop in, don't feel like you're struggling, don't feel like you're alone, and that's all. So let's get into today. So let's review some stuff about the Mesozoic world. So compared to today, the Mesozoic world was overall, so I'll give you a couple of seconds to think. So when we think about dinosaurs, what do we think about weather-wise, climate-wise? Okay, so overall, the Mesozoic was warmer and wetter. In the beginning, as Pangea was assembled in the early Triassic, it was warmer and it was quite a bit drier actually. And then through time, it kind of cooled off a little bit, got a little bit wetter. And that's kind of the typical Mesozoic climate we think of. But remember, even though it was hotter than today, it was still seasonal. Earth always had the seasons. The seasons were probably less different than each other, and the gradient between equator and pole was probably less, but there were still seasons, and there were dinosaurs that were probably adapted to cold weather. Probably not many of them, but it was a thing that happened. And then, so how do we even know what the weather was like during the Mesozoic? So how can we reconstruct the climates of the ancient past? So I'll give you a couple seconds to look at those options there. Okay, so tree rings, speleothems, cave formations, coral rings, all of these are examples of paleoclimate proxies. They're not actual direct measurements of temperature, they're not actually direct measurements of humidity, but we know how they respond to both of those. And we can analyze also stable isotopes in there to reconstruct the climates of the past. Obviously, we weren't around for direct measurements. This is long before historical archives could have been a thing. We can compare our climate to other planets, but I'm not sure how informative that is, but we could do it for sure. But really it's analyzing paleoclimate proxies, things like tree rings and other things that respond seasonally like tree rings. Okay, so we're going to talk about early dinosaurs, or really the evolution to get to early dinosaurs. So the first couple of slides is going to be a little bit of review. So remember this one giant leap, this major evolutionary leap forward, this kind of new innovation. Life developed in the oceans, initially single-celled, slowly got a little bit more complex over time. Eventually we got to metazoans, actual true animals, nothing like we think of animals today, very simple, like sea jellies, sea pens, things like that. Eventually we get to things like trilobites, we start seeing hard bodies, we start seeing predators, but again, life is in the oceans. We start seeing fish evolve. Finally, Tiktaalik, about 360, maybe a little bit earlier than that, transitions onto land. The first true land vertebrate. So remember that insects were already probably there. There's evidence of insect footprints in earlier sediments. So insects were already there, but this is the first vertebrate that comes up on land. So why did they do that? Well, again, the land is wide open. Insects are there, a good food source. Very primitive plants are there, fungi are there. It's this wide open space and nothing is tapping it. There's very little competition, whereas there's lots of competition in the oceans, lots of predators in the oceans. There's these untapped resources. And so this fishapod, transitional between a fish and a tetrapod, four-footed vertebrate. And then over time, we evolve into the ichthyostega and other like real true amphibians. And again, the amphibians, they need to keep their skin moist, they need to lay their eggs in water, they're tied to the water's edge until the invention of the amniotic egg. So the amniotic egg was this new adaptation to living on dry land. the amphibians were stuck at the water's edge. If they wanted to reproduce, they had to go back into the water. And so you couldn't venture out into the continental interiors, or you were stuck at the sea. But the amniotic egg was kind of a way that you could bring the sea along with you. It was kind of like a suitcase that you could bring seawater in with you and reproduce freely on dry land. And so when we think of eggs, we usually think of chicken eggs with the hard shell. That's probably what dinosaur eggs were like, with a hard calcareous shell. But you can also think of like crocodile eggs that have kind of that leathery shell, or like snake eggs are generally like that as well. I guess they're maybe more calcareous, probably a little bit of both. But this amniotic egg allows them to move further away from the water. And so we see that there's now this diversification that takes place, and they split off into a bunch of different lineages. Eventually there's kind of the lineage that eventually results in the mammals, which we'll talk about briefly today. And there's the lineage that leads through the Archosaurs and eventually to dinosaurs, which we'll talk heavily about today. So how do we tell these things apart? Well, so all amniotes, all creatures that have the amniotic egg, everything that comes on all the land vertebrates that are kind of past the amphibians, the amniotes are classified by the number and the position of the skull openings that are behind the eye on the skull. So if we look at this diagram here, there are the synapsids that have a single opening, so synapsid single opening. This is the mammal ancestral line. So mammals break off, eventually form from this line, the synapsids. We are synapsids. Mammals are a form of synapsids. Diapsids, like di means two, so two openings behind the eye. So here's the eye socket here, the orbital, and there's two openings behind the eye. There's obviously this opening here for the nose, the nares as well, but we're worried mostly about the ones behind the eye. So the diapsids have two openings behind the eye. These are the things that eventually become the modern reptiles, also the dinosaurs, and also birds. And then there's the anapsids, which have no openings behind the eye. Originally, these were thought to be turtles, because turtles do not have any openings in their skull. We'll talk a little bit about what turtles probably actually are in a second, but the primitive, very primitive reptiles are anapsids, and then turtles are the only living example, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's euryapsids, which aren't shown here. They have one opening, but it's basically the high opening on the skull here. The low opening is missing. They're modified diapsids, so they're diapsids that evolved towards only having one opening. So we'll discuss them a little bit later too. So, so remember, synapsids, single opening, diapsids, two opening. The synapsid line is important because we're synapsids, and the diapsid line is important is because dinosaurs are diapsids, and that's the differentiation here. That's the level that you need to understand this at. So let's take a look at the amniote cladogram. So again, remember that amniotes include all of the non-amphibian, non-insect land animals. So this is a very high level group. It includes a lot of things. So if we look at this Venn diagram here, there's the vertebrates, animals with backbones, and then there's the invertebrates that are outside of that circle. This is a very large circle that includes lots of different organisms, everything from fish to reptiles to mammals to humans. We're all vertebrates. We get a little bit more refined, and that's tetrapods, the animals with 4 limbs, tetrapod, 4 feet. So that discludes the fish. The fish are outgrouped from there. They don't have 4 limbs, they have 4 fins. But tetrapods include amphibians, it includes reptiles, it includes mammals. So now we further divide that into amniotes, amniotes with a self-contained egg. Amphibians are left behind in this group. They're tetrapods, but they're not amniotes. And then again, there's this split between synapsids, which is the mammal line synapsids, 1 hole, singular hole, diapsids, 2 holes behind the eye, diapsid 2. And that's the Lepidosaurs, the scaly lizards, and the Archosaurs, which are birds and dinosaurs and crocodilians. So this is a very basic cladogram over time, and you might see different versions of this because, again, remember that all cladograms are a work in progress. In fact, the cladogram behind me is very slightly different than this one. You see it's different structure. It's drawn as kind of more tree-like branching versus kind of more linear. That's just a style choice, but the actual content is somewhat different as well. But again, these are interpretations, these are works in progress. It's a good base to start from, and we're just gonna kind of walk up through this cladogram. So we start down here. These would be the amphibians, the first land vertebrates, and then there's the invention of the amniotic egg, and that's the amniota. At this node here is the earliest amniote common ancestor. The first thing that branches off are the synapsids, the mammal branch, and then everything down this way are the diapsid branch. Okay, so that's the first. So let's take a look at synapsids, and then we'll go further down the other line. So we're going to talk about the branch here. So synapsids, the earliest synapsids that you're probably familiar with were the pelycosaurs, these carnivorous sail-backed predators. And again, when we talked about what was your favorite dinosaur, a lot of people were maybe thinking Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon's not a dinosaur. Dimetrodon is actually a synapsid. Dimetrodon is a pelycosaur. Not everything that ends with saur is a dinosaur. Not everything that's big and old and scaly and dead is a dinosaur. These aren't even actually reptiles. They're on the synapsid line, which eventually becomes the mammals. The pelycosaur body line kind of dies out, and it's replaced by these carnivorous, sort of wolf-like kynodonts, and then the herbivorous kynodonts, dikynodonts, and dinocephalians. So there's kind of this like saber-toothed gorgonopsids, more of the herbivorous lepidosaurs, things like that. But these are pretty dominant throughout the Permian. And so this synapsid line is very successful in the Permian. Most of the larger animals on Earth are these synapsids, and the diapsids are kind of in the background, sort of an afterthought. But the larger synapsids die out at the end of the Permian, and that sort of opens the door for reptiles, for the diapsids. And so the Mesozoic, after the Permian, is the age of reptiles. Then there's the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, and that opens up for the age of mammals in the Cenozoic, the era that we're in now. So it's kind of been this pendulum kind of swinging back and forth. Initially, the synapsid line had the advantage, and then there was the Permian extinction. Things swung back to kind of favor the diapsids, the reptiles, and then after the impact, the Chicxulub impact, things swung back to favor the mammals. Why? Well, mammals are specially adapted. They're warm-blooded. They're all warm-blooded. They have hair, some less than others, but they're especially adapted for a cooling climate, which is what we see through most of the Cenozoic. And so at the end of the Cretaceous, the dinosaurs go extinct. The marine reptiles go extinct. The flying reptiles go extinct. There's something about the world after the impact that really is unfavorable for reptiles, and the small little tiny mammals that were crawling around, like the Morganucodonts and the small little like kind of shrew-sized mammals, once the dinosaurs are out of the way, they inherit the earth. We'll talk about that at the very end of the class, but this is just kind of funny, you know, the asteroids coming down. Save yourself, mammals will fend off the asteroids. That's not what happened. They're actually snacking on all the mammals. But basically the mammals, our line was kind of in the feet of the dinosaurs, in the shadow of the dinosaurs. And only after they were gone did mammals explode into all these unfilled niches. And so now a lot of the stuff that dinosaurs did, mammals do now. And so it's a very kind of different world. So that's the synapsid line. Let's go back to that amniote cladogram. The next thing is the reptilia. And we kind of have this separation here between the anapsids with no opening behind the eye and the diapsids that have two. So let's take a look at the anapsids, or we should say the quote unquote anapsids. So up until recently, so turtles and tortoises were considered the only living anapsids because they don't have a skull opening. This is a skull of a loggerhead turtle, and you see it has the orbital opening here, and there is no opening in the skull behind the eye socket. There's not one, there's not two, so they're not synapsids with one opening, they're not diapsids with two, they're anapsids with none. However, recent genetic evidence, again, we didn't have this sort of techniques before, recent genetic evidence indicates that they're probably actually diapsids, and that the closing of the holes is really just kind of a continuation of the rest of their kind of armoring up process. So if you look at a turtle skeleton, the shell has the spinal column kind of inside the shell, and the shell itself is actually their ribs being modified, and they sort of become kind of more and more spread out, more and more plate-like, and eventually they fuse into the shell. So like on cartoons, like when a turtle comes out of its shell, that's not what happens. The turtle's shell is their like chest cavity. The back is their shell, and the front is the plastron is their ribs. So like this empty cavity in here inside the shell, that's where all their viscera is. That's where their guts and organs are. A turtle without its shell would be like us without our skeleton, without our chest cavity. So again, this anapsids, probably the only true anapsids are the very primitive amphibians and the most primitive reptiles that have the no holes in the skull. Turtles is a convergence towards that form, just in the process of becoming more and more rigid, more and more armored. So turtles, you'll often see them as anapsids, they probably actually are not. So back to the amniote cladogram, the next thing is the diapsids. Again, the two holes behind the orbit. So this branches off into the Lepidosauria. So what are the Lepidosaurs? Lepidosaur, again, all these science words, they have usually either Greek or Latin roots. And if you know these bases, then they're usually descriptive. Some are more descriptive than others. So for example, Pachycephalosaur, thick-headed lizard, is very descriptive. We'll see a couple others that aren't quite so useful, but Lepidosaur means scaled lizards. So Lepidosaurs are everything we think of as a modern lizard, including snakes and also tuataras. So this is a tuatara. Superficially, it just looks like another kind of lizard, but they're genetically different. Their evolutionary history is different. It also includes the extinct mosasaurs. So mosasaurs, like we see on Jurassic World, that incredibly huge thing that jumps out and eats the great white. We'll talk about mosasaurs a little bit more next time. But mosasaurs were actually just a form of Lepidosaur, land-based scaled lizards that decided, I'm kind of sick of life on land, I'm going to go back to the seas. They did it very late in the age of dinosaurs, very late in the Mesozoic, alongside the dinosaurs on land and alongside the plesiosaurs and pliosaurs that were already there. Some groups of these Lepidosaurs, they actually favored reduced limbs until they favored them so much that they actually disappeared. So this is kind of like a speculative thing as to why. Maybe for like wiggling around underground. You don't need limbs. Snakes get around perfectly fine. If you've ever seen a snake climb a tree or up a cliff face, they're quite agile, and they're actually quite capable of grabbing onto things and kind of climbing up in ways that you wouldn't really expect from something that doesn't have hands and doesn't have limbs. How do we know the snake lost its legs? Well, we kind of see these transitional forms, and if you actually look at a male snake in particular, at the location on the belly where the pelvis used to be, there are actually these little spurs that kind of stick out. They're bones that are not attached, they're kind of free floating, evidence of the reduced hind limbs that used to be there that are now just a free floating bone. Evidence for evolution, just like the floating pelvis and femur in the dolphins and the whales that evolved from four-limbed terrestrial mammals. We've got these four-limbed ancestors here. Over time, the limbs become more and more reduced, and eventually they disappear, but their bodies still carry the evidence of that. We can still see that evolutionary history preserved in those vestigial structures. One thing that's a little bit frustrating about the Lepidosauurs, so for example, again, the Mosasaurs went back to the water. Most of the Lepidosauurs are very much terrestrial. Some like being in the water more than others. The marine iguana, for example, loves being in the water. But if you look at the skeleton of the marine iguana, if you look at their structures, there's nothing really here that would say that this is a predominantly marine organism. Their toes are not webbed. They have a little bit of maybe a sail on the back and then the tail, but you see that in other terrestrial forms as well. But we wouldn't be able to tell from fossils that these were very used to being in the water. Same thing with water monitors. Water monitors are very at home in the water. Not a lot from their skeletons that would tell us that too. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot that we don't know about behavior and that we don't know about ecology from looking at just the hard parts, and this is a good example of that. So back to the cladogram. The next step up is the Euryapsida. They're the next thing that branch off. And so let's take a look at the Euryapsida. So again, what defines the Euryapsida? Anapsids, no openings behind the eye socket. Synapsids, single opening behind the eye socket. Diapsids, two openings behind the eye socket. Euryapsid is a modified diapsid where they've lost the lower opening. They've evolved away. They've favored having only the upper opening preserved. So Euryapsids, there are no modern Euryapsids. Euryapsids include the marine reptiles, not the Mosasaurs. So again, Mosasaurs are Lepidosauros. They're on that previous branch. We'll talk about these a little bit more next class too, but these are the Ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, the Pliosaurs, and Plesiosaurs. So again, they evolved from diapsids, but they lost that lower skull opening. And what you see again here is these are probably the first, there may be others, but these are probably the first groups of fully adapted terrestrial vertebrates. So these are things that their ancestors evolved to live on dry land. They worked very hard to go from that amphibian stage to that primitive reptile stage with the amniotic egg and be comfortable living on land. These are the first ones that were like, you know what, maybe there's some opportunities in the ocean that we can exploit again, and they went back. We see this again later in the Cenozoic, where mammals do the same thing. The mammal line is initially fully adapted to life on land. There are no marine mammals, and then certain mammals start hanging out near the water's edge, start enjoying it, start becoming adapted to it, and then eventually they become full-on adapted to the marine, and we get the dolphins and the whales. And what you'll notice is that these marine reptiles look an awful lot like marine mammals. Again, it's an example of convergent evolution. Evolution is converging towards similar forms to solve a similar problem. These things are trying to get around in water, and to get around in water efficiently, fins is a really good idea. Hands don't work very well. Fingers don't paddle as good as fins. Having a nice streamlined body shape reduces your drag, lets you get around easier without wasting energy. And so you see a lot of forms. Like if I showed you a picture of this, you'd be like, yep, that's a dolphin. It's not, it's a marine reptile. It's an ichthyosaur. It's converged on that form. Entirely different evolutionary heritages. Again, the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, they're on that synapsid mammal line. These are on the extinct Euryapsid line. Two completely different evolutionary heritages converging on the same solutions to the same problem. Evolution has like a toolkit, and it knows that I'm trying to adapt to life in the water. These strategies work, these strategies don't. Eventually, the strategies that don't get filtered out through natural selection, the strategies that do are preserved and favored, and over time, we converge on those forms repeatedly. So fish evolved these forms in the Paleozoic, reptiles evolved these forms in the Mesozoic, mammals evolved these forms in the Cenozoic, converging towards the same solution to the same problem independently multiple times. Back to the cladogram again. So moving on up, up here is the branch to the Archosauria. And so we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit on the Archosaurs. So first of all, what is an Archosaur? So the dinosaur ancestors are these basal Archosaurs. So they originated in the very late Paleozoic. So again, in the Permian, right before that, the big Permian mass extinction. And this is kind of what they looked like. Very dinosaur-y. They look superficially like dinosaurs. A lot of them were bipedal, walking on two legs. That was a relatively new development, freed up their forelimbs for grasping and grabbing and catching prey, and eventually wings. The crocodilians preserved that 4-foot stance. So if we look at the tree here, we have these stem reptiles, these very basal reptiles that basically evolved directly from amphibians, the earliest reptiles. Again, we have that branch off to the synapsids, the therapsids, that eventually become the mammals. We have that anapsid branch. It says turtles here. Again, that's probably not actually where they belong. They're probably actually a branch off of these Lepidosaurs here. Then we have the diapsid branch, the Lepidosaurs, the scaly lizards, the snakes, the lizards, the tuataras. Again, the tuatara kind of looked like lizards, but they branched off way back here. So they're evolutionarily distinct, converging on a similar form to solve a similar problem. We have the euryapsids here, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and then this is the Archosaur line here. And the first thing that splits off are the crocodilians, then the pterosaurs, and then a bunch of different other groups. So let's zoom in on this portion of the tree. Let's look at just the Archosaurs. So this is a cladogram for the Archosauria, and we're going to work our way up this cladogram now. So again, cladogram, every node here is a common ancestor. It's separated by a newly derived character that separates these from everything before and everything after. And so at this niche here, this node here, the Archosaurs, the quote unquote ruling reptiles, they're divided into two major groups. Over here, the Crurotarsi, sometimes called the Pseudosuchians. That term sort of fell out of favor. It means false crocodiles. It fell out of favor because at the end of the false crocodile line are actual crocodiles, so it doesn't really kind of make a lot of sense. Crurotarsi kind of picked up favor, and it's just kind of like there's so many different groups that are under this umbrella that's sort of fallen out of favor, and now Pseudosuchians is sort of back. And again, all of these names, all of these bins are our efforts to kind of artificially group things together in ways that are useful to us, that kind of show us the evolutionary history. That cladogram was useful because it helps us see all these different forks, all these different branches. What are the evolutionary developments? What are the derived characteristics that make these things different from everything that came before? And what comes after on that line? Making these cladograms, again, it's a work in progress. It's a hypothesis. It's an idea, and they're always in flux. In fact, this one here, you actually see some question marks on here where we don't necessarily know the relationships enough to even speculate on drawing the line, but we did. So it's a hypothesis. It's our best approximation of the truth. It fits all the data that's available to the best that it can, but new data might come along that will refute that. For example, the turtles. Turtles look very much like anapsids. They don't have any skull openings. Let's put them in their group with the anapsids. We get new data very recently, within the last decade, genetic evidence that turtles are not anapsids. They're modified diapsids. Their one skull opening is a result of the two skull openings closing in the process of armoring and becoming more turtle-like, more tank-like. These cladograms allow us to investigate those problems. We can make predictions about some of the forms that we should see, and we can test those predictions. We can test those hypotheses. Where they work, we keep it. Where they don't, we revise it. And so this, again, this Archosauria cladogram If you Google Archosaurs cladogram, you'll probably find a couple different ones. We're getting closer to the truth all the time, but there's different ways you can draw these, different ways you can lump them. A good cladogram is a cladogram that's useful. And in this case, this is useful for showing us these branches. So this branch is the Querotarsi, again, sometimes referred to in the past as Pseudosuchians, becoming more in favor now again. And then this other group over here, all these things over in this side, the AV metatarsalia. So AV metatarsalia means bird metatarsals, so basically bird ankles. This includes dinosaurs, birds, and pterosaurs. So some of the main differentiating features here is that if we go back to the basal portion, the more primitive area of the tree, it's dominated by hips that are kind of flailed out to the side, kind of a sprawling stance. We think about like crocodiles, their legs are flailed out to the side. In the Rauisuchians, these guys here, there's this pillar erect stance where the hips are actually sort of up into a socket. And so the hips are kind of up almost like a platform, like a roof, and the pillars go down. And then the erect stance that is common in both dinosaurs and the mammals, it's very diagnostic of the dinosaur clad, is the femur comes up. It has a right angle into a hip socket that's actually totally open. There's a hole in the hip socket. Mammals have a very similar thing, except the hip socket's actually closed, but we have this kind of right angle femur into the hip socket. If you've ever seen an artificial hip, it's that ball and socket joint. The ball fits in there and it kind of rotates in that socket. This erect stance defines this half of the tree. Another thing that defines that half of the tree is this is the croc kind of wrist bone, or ankle bone, I should say, ankle structure, where we have kind of a split in here between these two ankle bones. And there's like a pillar and socket again that they can kind of twist on each other. And it allows the hand to kind of flail out to the sides easier. And so they are able to kind of sprawl their limbs out to the sides and their feet out to the sides at kind of an angle. This branch over here, the ones that walk in more of an erect stance, have kind of this hinge where it's more up and down, sorry, I should say like forward and back motion versus more of a sprawl out to the side. It's really hard to even do this with your hand because we are AV metatarsalia, ultimately. The mammals are, we have a hinge like that. So anyways, these are kind of defining characteristics. So let's kind of walk our way up some of the organisms on this branch of the tree. So there's the Phytosaurs. So phytosaur, if you remember, if you ever heard the word phytoplankton are plant-like plankton that photosynthesize. Phytosaurs means plant reptiles, which is sort of an unfortunate naming because they were originally thought to be plant eaters. If you look at this skull, look at the teeth on this. Are these plant-eating teeth? No, they're definitely not. So it was probably named when there was very little material available, certainly not jaw material with teeth, or else we would have made a very different interpretation and a very different name. And unfortunately, this name, there's the priority, and so it kind of follows this lineage, and we're kind of stuck with it. I wish we had a better system for changing names, but then people would get somewhat insulted if they're naming that they changed later, and it's kind of a political decision, a personal decision more than an actual scientific decision, but it keeps things orderly at least, so everyone knows what you're talking about when you say phytosaur. If we were changing everything all the time, like this name's not that great really, let's revise that. Again, like the confusion with Querotarsi and Pseudosuchian, going back and forth with that, it just caused a lot of confusion. But if you look at the Phytosaur skull, it looks a lot like a modern crocodile, and they had a similar lifestyle to modern crocodiles. Again, this is convergent evolution, evolution converging on a form that's quite successful. This is the shallow water ambush predator form. One crucial difference is that alligators and crocodilians have the nostrils way out at the end of the snout. Here, the Phytosaurs, their nostrils are actually on the top of their head. So same thing where they can have their nostrils up out of the water as their eyes are out of the water and they can breathe. Crocodiles do the same thing, except their nostrils are way out at the end, but they're solving the same problem. How can I be mostly under the water and still breathe? They're just solving it slightly differently. These Phytosaurs are probably the top aquatic predator of the Triassic. So these things are very dominant in the Triassic. They're heavily armored. They have these bony scute plates on their back. They have very thick ribs. They're even more armored than crocodiles, but superficially they resemble them. You can see the human here for scale. These are large animals, large apex predators, and they are the top of the food chain or near the top of the food chain in the Triassic. And they're probably snacking on early dinosaurs and certainly early mammals as they come to the water's edge to drink. The next group along here are the Rauisuchians. So this is one of the things. So the last one, Phytosaur, was outright misleading. The plant lizard, not very helpful. This one, Rau's crocodile, I don't know who Rau is. It's not the person that named them. Rau's crocodile, okay, not super helpful, not very descriptive, but that's the name. They're the dominant land predators. Some are mostly carnivorous, but some are scavengers, some are herbivores. Throughout the Triassic, these are the dominant land predators. These are the apex predators of the Triassic. So again, we think of the Mesozoic, we think of the age of reptiles, we think of the age of the dinosaurs. In the Triassic, these things were snacking on dinosaur ancestors, early basal dinosaurs. And they very much look like dinosaurs. So if you saw a picture of these, you'd be like, yeah, I mean, that's a dinosaur. Look at the skeleton, especially the skull here. I mean, yeah, that's a dinosaur. Why are we calling it something different? There were some more kind of slender forms. Most of these bulkier forms were probably mostly quadrupedal. You can see that their center of gravity is kind of shifted more towards center of mass, whereas something that walks upright more of the time, the center of gravity is kind of more over the hips, as we'll see with the dinosaurs. Many of the dinosaurs anyways. But these things, they kind of have, it's not the sprawling crocodile-like stance. Again, it's this pillar erect stance here, where they have kind of this hip platform and the columns go out straight down. Again, the main difference why these things are not dinosaurs is that dinosaurs have this ball and socket kind of hookup where you have this opening in the hip socket. This is diagnostic of dinosaurs. And then again, there's the wrist differences. But these things were dominant in the Triassic, and they were eating dinosaurs. They were suppressing dinosaurs. They were outcompeting the earliest dinosaurs, and dinosaurs didn't have a chance to get really large like this because the Rauisuchians were filling that niche. But then something changed. So let's talk about that in just a second. So one very interesting fossil that was found, and it's just a single leg bone, kind of walking through this whole story. So again, like, kind of think of paleontology, think of geology almost like forensic science. You're trying to reconstruct the past from the evidence that's there. But these Phytosaurs, these Rauisuchians, on this separate branch away from the dinosaurs, these things are the dominant predators in Triassic. Again, like, there were a lot of discussions, a discussion board about like who would win between like T-Rex and Velociraptor or other dinosaurs. Like, think about like a lion versus like a hyena. That fight doesn't happen very often. they're not usually trying to fight each other. They might like scuffle over food, but they're not going to like actively fight each other all the time. They're busy trying to hunt prey. Any effort spent to fight off other predators is dangerous, and you don't want to do that. You're trying to conserve resources. So fights between top predators are not common, but they're not unheard of. And so this bone specimen actually records a Rauisuchian, one of these big kind of quadrupedal, not really crocodiles because they're more upright and erect, but it's got a tooth mark in there, and the tooth is actually in the bone. It's embedded in the femur here of a Phytosaur. A Phytosaur bit this Rauisuchian on the leg, and it healed up. Now there's unhealed bite marks elsewhere on the bone from another Rauisuchian. And then finally on the bone, there's unhealed scratch marks from a smaller, probably again a smaller Phytosaur from scavenging. So from this one bone, we kind of see this attempted predation, actual predation, and then the scavenging. And so again, these Phytosaurs are dominant aquatic predators. The Rauisuchians are the dominant carnivore on land, but they go extinct at the end of the Triassic. Why? Dinosaurs, there's a big mass extinction at the end of the Triassic. Why, what's the cause is a little bit uncertain, but it's probably related to climate change. The climate starts kind of cooling a little bit, still very warm, but it starts cooling. Were the dinosaurs better adapted to that colder environment? So again, increasingly, we think dinosaurs might have had feathers. These things probably almost certainly did not. There's no evidence for that. Was that the big advantage, or were dinosaurs kind of more warm-blooded, mesothermic versus cold-blooded, which these things almost certainly were distinctly cold-blooded? Was bipedalism some big advantage? So there's all these different things, but dinosaurs eventually outcompeted these things because of the end Triassic extinction. If it wasn't for that end Triassic extinction, dinosaurs would never have gotten to all the different body plans that we see later. And at the very end of that tree, if we think back to that tree, the crocodilians are at the end there. Crocodilians include all the modern crocodiles, modern alligators, caimans, gharials, and all of their ancient ancestors. They are defined by they've retained or possibly even regained that primitive sprawling gait of their amphibian ancestor with the limbs sprawled out to the side. They're fully quadrupedal. An alligator cannot stand up on its hind legs. The center of mass is too far forward. That's not to say that they're slow. So sprawling kind of implies slow and plodding. Alligators are actually capable of kind of getting up into an erect stance and doing a kind of quick dash. They're shockingly fast when they do that. A lot of people get surprised. A lot of prey get surprised, and they don't live to tell about it. Look at all these different crocodilomorphs here. Dinosuchus is probably the most famous one. Just this massive crocodilian from the Mesozoic. You see here taking on a hadrosaur, one of the quote-unquote duck-billed dinosaurs, which we'll talk about later on in the course. Dinosaurs were not the only big bad things around in the Mesozoic. There were large crocodilians around too. And also, all of the big large reptiles were not Mesozoic. So this Pterosaurus here, this is actually from the Miocene. So large reptiles evolved after the Mesozoic, kind of rare-ish, because again, mammals fill a lot of those niches, but there were large crocodilians later on too. So back to the Archosauria cladogram. Now we're going to kind of go up this branch. The first branch off is the Pterosauria. So here's the pterosaurs. They're not actually dinosaurs. They're very closely related to dinosaurs. They're only a couple branches removed. They're closer related to dinosaurs than crocodiles are, but they're not dinosaurs. They're archosaurs. They're a type of archosaur. And there's, again, these two main groups, the rhamphorhynchoids and probably the more well-known pterodactyls. Earlier forms probably glided, but later were definitely active flyers, probably really great flyers. Some were probably capable of circumnavigating the globe. They were cosmopolitan everywhere, and some argument about whether their back legs were connected with membrane. The exact shape of the wing has been argued over. Some recent fossils have sort of like shed a little bit of light on that. We'll talk about that on Wednesday when we dig into these groups, the pterosaurs, the not dinosaurs. But that's all I really want to talk about them for now. Just know that pterosaurs are closely related to dinosaurs, but they're not actually dinosaurs. Here they are branching off back here on the same line as dinosaurs, but they branch off a little bit earlier. And then I'm going to kind of group all three of these kind of together. These are the Dinosauromorpha, the Dinosaur forms, and then the Silosauridae. They're kind of these outgroups that are, you know, really close to dinosaurs, but not quite. They don't have all of the characteristics of dinosaurs. They just have some of the characteristics of dinosaurs. So they don't quite fit. So these are the almost dinosaurs. And again, the closer we get to the true dinosaurs, the harder it is to draw these artificial lines. Where is that group? So like Lagopetidae, this is a Lagopetid here. That looks an awful lot like a dinosaur. It's very similar superficially to a dinosaur, but it doesn't have that open hip socket, and it doesn't have the fused hip vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae. This may actually be a kind of basal pterosaur, a pterosaur ancestor, so it might actually belong slightly different place on the tree. Again, these are hypotheses. Mesozoic has, again, that bipedal stance that's pretty similar to dinosaurs. They have a very dinosaur-like hip, so it's not that Rauisuchian platform hip, it's the ball and socket hip, but it's not perforated, and they have kind of that more primitive crocodilian ankle structure. And then there's the Silosauridae, which are so close to dinosaurs that sometimes they are actually lumped in with there, but they're these little insectivorous quadrupedal. Again, it looks a lot like a dinosaur. The closer we get to dinosaurs, the harder it is to draw that line. Like, this is dinosaur, this is not. How do you define that? So back to the tree, the last step is all the way up to the actual dinosauria themselves. We finally arrived to the dinosaurs with their erect stance, with the perforated hip, with the Ava metatarsidae joint. So how do we actually define a dinosaur? We talked about this a lot earlier in the beginning of the course, but dinosaurs differ from other reptiles in a few different ways. So again, dinosaurs are a different flavor of reptile. They're at this place on the cladogram. They're a very, very specific group, and these are the criteria, or at least some of the criteria, that define the dinosaurs, or at least the basal dinosaurs. In later generations, some of these things are altered. Some of these things are changed. So for example, the turtles sealing up that part of their head, that's something that changed later. But dinosaurs are defined by the hip structure, again, having that hole in the hip socket to accommodate that upright stance, the femur being at a 90-degree angle to kind of pop into that hole, again, to get the upright stance balanced above there. The ankle structure, that first row of ankle bones being usually fused, in some cases fused to the tibia and fibia, the lower leg bones, and then having that hinged joint versus that kind of sprawling out to the side joint of the crocodilomorphs, the cruotarsi. And then the other thing, the last thing, is the sacrum, the 3+ fused vertebrae at the hip, whereas other reptiles mostly have 2. Again, this is to accommodate that bipedal upright stance. They need a little bit more structural stability in that hip. The hip vertebrae are fused together to accommodate the fact that the center of mass is over the hips, transferred straight down into the erect bipedal stance with that flexing, hinged ankle joint that accommodates better this bipedal motion. So if we look at dinosaurs, they're all kinds of different stances. So the original bipedal dinosaurs, some of them eventually do revert back to the 4-footed stance when they become so freaking massive, the big sauropods. But another thing to see on here is that the Triassic dinosaurs, when the Rauisuchians and the Phytosaurs were around, they're relatively small. Only at the very end of the Triassic do we start seeing some larger dinosaurs. And then once we get into the Jurassic, once we're past that late Triassic extinction, we start seeing some of the bigger dinosaurs ever, the biggest dinosaurs really. And then as we get into the Cretaceous, kind of the golden age of dinosaurs, we see all this different diversity, all these different body forms, all these different dinosaurs that we associate with as dinosaurs. Jurassic Park should probably actually be called Cretaceous Park, although Stegosaurs and Brachiosaurs are certainly in there. And then the next thing we're going to get to is dinosaur evolution. We'll talk about all this in detail later. I'm not going to get into it too much, but there's kind of the big separation: Sauriscia, lizard-hipped, Ornithischia, bird-hipped. That's all I'm going to say for today. We'll get into details later, but that's all we got. So hope you enjoyed that, and